The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange as Helen prepared dinner in the small kitchen of the modest apartment where she lived with her daughter Sophie and her husband Robert. Her delicate fingers precisely cut the vegetables, but her eyes, deep like dark water wells, constantly strayed to the clock hanging on the wall. 8 o'clock. Robert would arrive soon, and that thought made her heart race in an anguished dance of fear and apprehension. The marks on her wrists, still slightly purple from the last time she had tried to defend her daughter, seemed to burn under the dim lamplight illuminating the room, like glowing embers reminding her of the hell her marriage had become in recent years. Sophie, only 12 years old, sat at the table worn by time, leaning over her math notebook, absent-mindedly nibbling her pencil. Her eyes, faithful copies of her mother's, held a premature maturity that no child should possess. The apartment, although simple, was kept with a care that betrayed Helen's effort to create an environment of normalcy for her daughter, like a delicate nest built amidst a relentless storm. Photographs on the wall showed happier times, when Robert's smile was not just a mask preceding the violence of his fists. "Mom," Sophie called, breaking the silence that hovered like a heavy cloud over them. "Do you think he'll come home okay today?" Her small voice carried a world of worries, while her fingers nervously twisted the end of the braid Helen had made that morning, promising it would be a better day than the one before. Helen set the knife down on the cutting board and approached her daughter, caressing her raven black hair. "I don't know, my love," she answered honestly, her eyes reflecting an ancestral pain that seemed to transcend that moment. "But no matter how he comes home, I'm here to protect you, always." Her words, though soft, carried the strength of an unbreakable promise, etched not only in her heart, but in every fiber of her being. The sound of keys in the hallway made them both freeze, like gazelles sensing a predator approaching on the savannah. The door burst open and Robert stumbled in, his red eyes and alcohol-laden breath announcing the storm brewing. Helen quickly placed herself between the door and her daughter, an instinctive gesture of protection that had become almost a reflex after so many years. "What are you looking at?" Robert bellowed, violently throwing his coat onto the couch. "This house is a mess. And the food? Not even ready yet?" His words slurred, tripping over each other like his stumbling body down the apartment's narrow hallway. "It's almost ready, Robert," Helen replied, trying to keep her voice calm like someone trying to appease a wild beast. "Sophie was just finishing her math homework before helping me set the table. Sit down. I'll get you a glass of water." Her fingers trembled slightly as she filled the glass, crystalline drops spilling onto the counter like silent tears. Robert grabbed the glass roughly, spilling half the contents onto his already crumpled shirt. His alcohol-clouded eyes fixed on Sophie, who was discreetly trying to gather her school materials, as if she could make herself invisible. "You," he pointed an accusing finger, "should be helping your mother instead of messing with that homework crap. What's the point of studying if you'll end up just like her?" "Robert, please," Helen interceded, pleading in her voice mixed with growing firmness. "She needs to study for a better future. Leave her alone. She did nothing wrong." "Did nothing wrong?" Robert's voice rose like thunder, announcing the coming storm. "Just existing is wrong enough. Another useless mouth to feed, and you defend her like she's a queen." In a sudden movement, he lunged at Sophie, who recoiled in fright. The chair toppled from the abrupt motion, and the girl tried to protect herself. Something within Helen broke at that moment, like a dam finally yielding to the relentless pressure of the waters. All the years of abuse, all the nights of silent tears, all the accumulated fear transformed into a primal, visceral force that propelled her toward Robert. "Never touch her again," she screamed, grabbing the first object her hands found, the heavy iron pot that had belonged to her grandmother. The impact was followed by a dull thud. Robert fell heavily to the worn linoleum floor, unconscious. Helen, in shock, let the object fall from her trembling hands, the metallic clang reverberating against the walls. Helen, in shock, let the pot drop from her trembling hands, the metallic clang echoing against the walls like a distant echo of the violence that had just occurred. "Mom?" Sophie's small, frightened voice seemed to come from far away, even though she was only a few steps away. "Is he dead?" Before Helen could answer, loud knocks on the door announced the arrival of neighbors, attracted by the screams and the thud. "Mrs. Helen? Is everything okay in there? We called the police. They're on their way." The words pierced through the fog of shock enveloping Helen, bringing her back to the cruel reality of what she had done. Looking at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else, Helen whispered, "What have I done? Oh God, what have I done?" Hot tears streamed down her face, mingling with the drops of blood that had splattered on her blouse. She looked at Sophie, the terror in her daughter's eyes reflecting her own horror. "It wasn't meant to end like this, my daughter. I only wanted to protect you." The sirens were approaching, their wail cutting through the night like an omen of separation and suffering. Helen knew there would be no escape, that their paths would diverge on that fateful night. She hugged Sophie tightly, as if she could fuse their bodies and souls, protecting her forever. "Listen to me," she urgently whispered against Sophie's hair. "Be strong. Never forget that everything I did was out of love for you. Promise me you'll survive no matter what happens." When the door finally yielded to the force of the police officers, Helen was already standing, her hands extended in surrender, but her eyes, fixed on Sophie, conveyed a silent message that transcended the handcuffs that would soon encircle her wrists. A mother's true love knows no bounds, not even those imposed by the law of men. The days in the hospital dragged on like sluggish snakes under the relentless sun as Robert recovered from the blow that had nearly claimed his life. The scar on his temple, red and protruding like a stigma, pulsed with every beat of his heart, poisoned by resentment. His eyes, once clouded only by alcohol, were now permanently shadowed by a hatred that grew like a weed in fertile soil, feeding on the memories of Helen's betrayal and Sophie's accusing presence, whose existence was a constant reminder of his humiliation. In the small living room of the apartment, where now only father and daughter cohabited as strangers united by poisoned blood ties, Sophie walked like a ghost, trying to make herself invisible so as not to awaken the beast that slumbered in her father's chest. The walls, once silent witnesses to shouting and tears, now seemed to suffocate her with the weight of the silence Robert imposed as punishment. "Why are you still here looking at me with those eyes just like hers?" he bellowed one night, breaking the tomb-like silence that had settled between them since they returned from the hospital. "Every time I see you, I remember your mother chose you over me, that she preferred to go to jail rather than continue being my wife." Sophie shrank like a flower under a merciless storm, her watery eyes reflecting the cruel glint of the bottle Robert held like an extension of his own being. "It wasn't like that, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling like the flame of a candle about to be extinguished. "Mom just wanted to protect me. She always loved you, even when you—" "Shut up!" Robert's shout cut through the air like a whip, making Sophie recoil against the wall. "I don't care what you think. From now on, you're on your own. Get your own money, make your own food. I'm sick of looking at your face and seeing hers." With an abrupt motion, he threw some bills on the table like tossing scraps to an unwanted animal. The following morning, when the first rays of sun filtered through the faded curtains, Sophie awoke to find the apartment empty of presence, but filled with Robert's deafening absence. His clothes had vanished from the closet as if they had never existed, along with the few personal belongings he kept. On the kitchen table, only a crumpled note with words written in the fury of one who wishes to hurt beyond distance. "Don't look for me. You're now the state's problem, just like your mother chose to be." Alone, abandoned by her own blood, Sophie embraced herself in a vain attempt to contain the tremor that shook her small body. The tears rolling down her cheeks fell to the floor like raindrops in a desert, unable to fertilize any hope in her heart, devastated by the cruelty of fate. The rain lashed against the windows of the small apartment, as if the very sky wept for Sophie's abandonment, a girl whose eyes, once bright as stars on a summer night, now seemed like pools of shadow where her lost childhood drowned. The days dragged on like chained prisoners, each second marked by the relentless hand of the wall clock, the only sound besides her solitary breathing in that space which had once sheltered a family and now held only the ghosts of shattered memories. The bills arrived mercilessly, piling up on the kitchen table like fallen autumn leaves, while the refrigerator, day by day, revealed its growing scarcity, as if it too wasted away in solidarity with the girl abandoned by her own father, who had departed taking not only his presence, but any vestige of parental responsibility. It was on the third week after the abandonment that the sound of hesitant knocks on the door broke the sepulchral silence of the apartment. Like a frightened animal, Sophie approached cautiously, her steps almost inaudible on the cold floor. On the other side was Aunt Margaret, a 60-year-old woman with deep wrinkles that told stories of a life of sacrifice and eyes that, despite time, retained the gleam of compassion. The sister of Sophie's late maternal grandmother, she was the only family tie left to the girl after Helen was taken away, and Robert vanished like smoke in the wind. "My little one," said Aunt Margaret. Her voice choked as she beheld the evident thinness on her grandniece's face, the deep shadows ringing her eyes like halos of suffering. "Forgive me for taking so long. I only just found out everything." Your mother wrote me from prison, desperate without news of you. Aunt Margaret brought with her bags of provisions, like an angel of salvation amidst the desert of abandonment in which Sophie found herself. Her hands wrinkled by time prepared the first decent meal the girl had eaten in weeks, while explaining her situation with words heavy with sadness. I cannot take you with me, my angel. My room in the boarding house where I live barely fits my bed and my few things, but I will come every day, bring food and help you as I can. I will not abandon you as that wretch did, the one I once called my nephew. Her eyes, rimmed with unshed tears, expressed the frustration of one who wished to offer much more than her circumstances allowed. Behind the grey walls of the women's prison, Helen faced her own demons, each day a battle against the despair that threatened to consume her like voracious flames. The nights were her cruelest enemies, for it was then that the nightmares came, where she saw Sophie crying, calling for her, while sinister shadows surrounded her little daughter. The rough prison uniform chafed against her skin as a constant reminder of their forced separation, and the other inmates, many hardened by lives of crime and violence, looked at her like a stray lamb, too fragile for the slaughterhouse in which they all found themselves. "Please, Madam Warden," Helen implored during yet another of her countless requests, her knees against the cold floor, "I need only to know if my daughter is well. I have not received news for weeks. For the love of God, she's only 12 years old and alone." Aunt Margaret's letter, when it finally arrived, was like water in the desert for Helen's parched soul. Knowing that Sophie was not completely helpless brought momentary relief to the constant torment gnawing at her chest. Every line of the letter was imbued with a mother's fierce determination, who refused to let herself be beaten down, no matter how dark the night she was now living. "I will get out of here," Helen swore to herself, her fingers gripping the crumpled paper from so many rereadings, "even if I have to tear these bars out with my own hands." The prison walls, however, did not yield easily to the vows of a desperate mother. Helen faced 2 attempted assaults, 3 stints in solitary for defending weaker inmates, and countless sleepless nights before her perseverance impressed even the most cynical guards. Her exemplary behavior, willingness to work the worst prison tasks, and ability to diffuse conflicts between inmates eventually drew the attention of the penitentiary board. "Inmate Helen Carter," announced the warden, her austere countenance hiding any trace of emotion. "After evaluating your conduct during these 2 years of incarceration, the board has decided to grant you conditional release. You may work during the day, returning to sleep at the penitentiary. Any violation of this trust will bring you back to closed regime." Understood. The first time Helen stepped outside the prison walls, after 2 years of incarceration, the spring sun seemed to burn her with its intensity, as if punishing her eyes for so long in the half-light. The bus that would take her to the neighborhood where she had left Sophie moved with torturous slowness, each stop prolonging the agony of separation that was now about to end. Her heart hammered against her chest, like a bird desperate for freedom, while her trembling, sweaty hands clung to the small bag of belongings she carried with her, all that remained of her former life. The building where she had lived seemed smaller and more dilapidated than in her memories, as if it too had suffered from the years of her absence. Each creaking step of the stairwell was a station of a 2-year-long Calvary, each floor a layer of purgatory she needed to cross to reach the paradise that was her daughter's face. When she finally reached the familiar door, her legs almost gave way under the overwhelming weight of emotion that overcame her. 3 soft knocks, and then the sweetest sound her ears could conceive, approaching footsteps from the other side. The door opened slowly, revealing not the 12-year-old child she kept in her memories, but a 14-year-old girl whose eyes, mirrors of Helen's own soul, widened in disbelief and jubilation. "Mom?" Sophie's voice, now a little deeper from the years of puberty, broke on the second syllable, as if the word were too precious to be pronounced in full. "Mom, is it really you?" The embrace that followed was like 2 continents separated by oceans finally reuniting, a tectonic meeting of emotions so intense they could reconfigure the very map of their existences. Helen felt Sophie's body, now taller, still frail, but with the first signs of the woman she was becoming. "My daughter," she whispered, between sobs that seemed to tear pieces of her soul. "Forgive me for leaving you. Every day, every second away from you was an eternity of torment, but now I'm here, and I swear by everything sacred that we will never be separated again." Aunt Margaret watched the scene with teary eyes, her wrinkled hands clutching a worn handkerchief against her trembling lips, as if trying to contain her own overflowing emotion at witnessing that reunion. "This girl is as strong as you, Helen, said the old woman between tears that now streamed freely down her time-furrowed cheeks. "She survived like a flower in the desert, without water or sun, but still, she blossomed. Now you two need to rebuild what was broken." The days that followed were ones of adjustment, like two dancers relearning the steps of an interrupted choreography. Helen threw herself desperately into the search for employment, her feet covering the city streets from dawn to dusk, knocking on doors that often closed upon hearing the word ex-convict. Each rejection was a sharp blade against her already wounded pride, but in her heart burned the inextinguishable flame of maternal determination. "No matter what it takes," she declared one night, as they shared the modest dinner Aunt Margaret had brought, "I will clean floors, wash clothes, do any honest work to give us a decent life." What Helen did not know, as she held Sophie's hands across the worn table of that apartment that had witnessed so much suffering, was that fate, on its unpredictable chessboard, was moving its pieces in a dark game. On the other side of the city, in an imposing mansion where misery had never dared penetrate, a woman of aristocratic bearing contemplated her 30-year-old son, whose outward beauty masked a soul corroded by vices and excesses. "We will find a solution, my son," she promised, her eyes reflecting a blind devotion that, like an eclipse, obscured her moral discernment. "No one will hurt you as long as I live, even if I have to eliminate anyone who dares threaten you." The crystal chandeliers poured golden light over the polished marble of the main hall of the Whitmore mansion, where every piece of furniture and work of art proclaimed not only wealth, but generations of privilege and power. Constance, a 55-year-old woman whose aristocratic elegance defied the relentless advance of time, nervously adjusted the genuine pearl necklace adorning her slender neck, as her eagle-sharp eyes followed her son's agitated movements. Daniel, a 30-year-old man who had inherited his mother's stunning beauty but none of her virtues, paced the room like a caged animal, his hands subtly trembling, a symptom Constance had learned to identify after years of observing the gradual decline of the one who was, nonetheless, the sun around which her particular universe orbited. Franklin, the 60-year-old patriarch whose business empire had transformed his surname into a synonym for economic power, observed the scene from his usual throne, an Italian leather armchair strategically positioned by the marble fireplace. His eyes, once vibrant, now merely reflected the weariness of one who had witnessed his son's downfall without being able to prevent it, like watching an avalanche destroy everything in its path without being able to do more than witness the devastation. The oppressive silence hovering in the room was occasionally broken by the tinkling of ice in the whiskey glass Daniel clutched, as if it were an anchor amid the storm of his own tortuous thoughts. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday," Constance finally announced, her controlled voice masking the whirlwind of emotions that stirred her maternal heart. "Captain Montgomery came to see me personally at the club, in front of all my friends, as if I were a common criminal." Her last words came out poisoned by the outrage of a woman accustomed to being revered, not confronted. Daniel turned abruptly, spilling part of the amber drink on the Persian rug that had cost the equivalent of 10 ordinary workers' annual salary. His bloodshot and feverish eyes revealed the barely contained panic that consumed him from within like corrosive acid. "What did that damn man say? He has no evidence. He can't link me to that place. I took all precautions." His voice, once melodious like that of the promising young man he had been, now came out scratched, as if each word were forced through glass shards lodged in his throat. "He has everything, Daniel. Witnesses, images, even phone recordings," Constance replied, each word falling like a death sentence in the opulent silence of the room. "Not only about your consumption, but about the debts with traffickers, about your involvement in drug distribution at the yacht club. He said that this time, not even all your father's money will be able to save you." Franklin rose suddenly, his imposing figure casting an elongated shadow over his son, like a foreboding of the grim fate that awaited him. "Enough, Constance. This time I won't interfere. I've paid lawyers, I've bribed judges, I've bought victims' silence, and for what? To see him sink deeper and deeper into that bottomless pit. Perhaps it's time to face the consequences once and for all." His voice, grave and authoritative like that of one who had spent a lifetime giving orders that were promptly obeyed, echoed through the mansion's walls like a final sentence. Constance advanced like a lioness defending her cub, positioning herself between husband and son, her eyes shooting invisible daggers of maternal fury. "Don't you dare abandon him now, Franklin. He's our only son, the flesh of our flesh. How can you speak of letting him face alone something that could destroy him forever?" The tears now freely welling from her eyes seemed like liquid crystals sliding down her perfectly made-up face, saline trails of despair that not all the money in the world could stanch. "I'll talk to Montgomery," Constance declared after her husband left the room, slamming the door with enough force to make the crystals of the chandeliers chime like distant bells announcing catastrophe. There must be something he wants, some price he's willing to accept. Every man has his price. Her words came out determined, although her heart knew this battle would be different from all the previous ones she had fought to protect her son. The next morning, Captain Montgomery's austere office seemed even more intimidating under the harsh light of fluorescent lamps that made no concessions to imperfections. The 45-year-old man, whose face marked by bullet scars and the weight of impossible decisions told stories no official report would ever record, stared at Constance with the impassiveness of one who had seen it all and was no longer impressed by tears or pleas, let alone veiled threats. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your maternal concern," he said, his controlled voice like that of one who measures each word with surgical precision. "But your son is no longer a rebellious teenager. He's an adult man who has chosen not only to destroy his own life, but to profit from the destruction of others' lives. The drugs he helps distribute are killing young people, destroying entire families. This time, not even your illustrious surname will be able to save him." Constance opened her crocodile leather purse, extracting from it a checkbook whose ivory cover bore the family crest. "Captain, I know you're a man of principles." Her voice, now honey poured over stone, smooth but unable to penetrate it. "But I also know your salary barely covers the needs of a decent life. Think of your family, your future. None of us wants a scandal that would tarnish not only the Whitmore name, but also the reputation of this city we love so much." Captain Montgomery not only refused the check, but stood up abruptly, his gaze hardened by the indignation that not even years of dealing with corruption had managed to dull. "You have just added attempted bribery of an authority to the list of crimes associated with your name. Lucky for you, I won't file that yet, but as for your son, he will face justice like any other trafficker, even if I have to dedicate the rest of my career to seeing him behind bars." Constance returned to the mansion like a shipwreck survivor, drenched not by seawater, but by the icy terror that now circulated in her veins instead of blood. Her steps echoed through the empty corridors like the tolling of a clock counting the final hours of her son's freedom. In her room, locked away from her husband's or servant's gaze, she allowed herself to collapse completely, her sobs shaking her frail body like winter's relentless winds shaking withered branches. "I can't lose him," she whispered to the child portrait of Daniel she kept on her bedside table, her trembling fingers caressing the glass as if they could touch that innocent boy who had once been the light of her days. "I won't allow them to tear you away from me, my son, even if I have to cross hell itself to prevent it." It was during the sleepless night, while watching the full moon pour its silvery light over the mansion's immaculate garden, that the terrible thought began to form in her mind, like poison, distilled drop by drop. If the law refused to bend before her money and influence, then the law had to be eliminated. Not the institution itself, but its most obstinate representative, the one who had dared to threaten the freedom of the son, who was her only reason for living. The plan began to take shape in her mind with frightening clarity. She would eliminate Captain Montgomery, but she would need a scapegoat, someone to carry the blame while she remained above any suspicion, protected by the cloak of respectability that her surname and fortune provided. Her eyes, now dry and calculating, fixed on the open newspaper on her desk, where a small classified ad offered a position for a domestic worker in a family residence. Her hands, which had never performed work more strenuous than arranging Carter or choosing jewels, now trembled slightly as she wrote the text of her own ad, bait that would lure the sacrificial pawn into her macabre game. "Forgive me, God," she murmured in the oppressive silence of the room, though in her heart she already knew that she had crossed a frontier from which there would be no return. Motherly love, that feeling which should be the purest expression of humanity, had been transformed in her hands into the most terrible of weapons, capable of justifying even cold-blooded murder. The newspaper would be published the following morning, and with it, the first step of a plan that would intertwine her privileged destiny with that of an unknown, some woman desperate enough to accept working in the Whitmore mansion. What Constance could not foresee, as she sealed her homicidal decision, was that fate, in its cruel irony, had already chosen the perfect piece for her game, a mother as desperate as herself, though for diametrically opposite reasons. Constance's private office, decorated with fine woods and period furniture that whispered stories of generations of wealth, had in recent weeks become the center of operations for her meticulous plan, transforming from a sanctuary of elegance into a laboratory of calculated evil. The Whitmore matriarch examined for the third time the resumes scattered across her hand-carved mahogany desk, her eyes as keen as those of a bird of prey, scrutinizing every detail, every gap in those desperate women's stories who were desperate enough to accept the job of serving one of high society's most demanding families. Her diamond and ruby-ringed fingers drummed impatiently on the paper as her mind dissected each candidate like a cruel surgeon, seeking not competence or experience, but vulnerabilities that could be exploited, frailties that would make one of them the perfect puppet in her macabre theater of deception and death. The mansion's doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of the last interviewee of the day, the one whose short resume full of unexplained gaps had piqued her predatory curiosity. Constance adjusted her perfectly styled and dyed hair, donned once more the mask of benevolent aristocrat she wore for the world, and allowed herself one last look in the Venetian mirror adorning the wall. The reflected image showed not the potential murderess she had become, but the respectable society lady everyone knew and revered. "You may send her in, Fatima," she ordered the housekeeper, awaiting her instructions on the other side of the heavy door, her melodious voice camouflaging the venom that now ran in her veins instead of the blue blood she took such pride in possessing. Helen crossed the immense entrance hall of the Whitmore mansion, feeling diminished by the ostentatious opulence that surrounded her on all sides, as if the very environment designed to impress was also designed to remind people like her of the subordinate place they occupied in the world. Her work-calloused hands gripped her worn purse with unnecessary force, while her eyes, which had already shed enough tears to form an ocean of sadness, absorbed every detail of that palace that represented a world as distant from her reality as the stars are from the earth. The past few days had been a succession of doors slammed in her face, of looks of distrust when mentioning her time in prison, of hopes raised only to be brutally crushed against the cold floor of reality, each rejection deepening the scar on her already so marked soul. "Mrs. Helen Carter, I presume?" Constance's voice, melodious as silver bells, interrupted her thoughts when she was finally led into the private office. The woman watching her from behind the imposing desk was the personification of everything Helen could never be: elegant, powerful, born to command rather than obey. "Please, have a seat. Your resume intrigued me. I see there is a 2-year gap in your recent history." The aristocrat's eyes sparkled with a curiosity that Helen mistakenly interpreted as genuine human interest, when in fact it was the predatory gleam of a spider assessing the fly that had just landed in her meticulously woven web. Helen took a deep breath, the words she needed to say burning her throat like embers. During her previous interviews, she had tried to omit her past, but the gaps raised more suspicion than the truth, as painful as it was. I was serving time, ma'am," she finally confessed, her eyes fixed on her own hands so as not to see the judgment that would surely arise on the interviewer's face. "I assaulted my ex-husband to defend my daughter from the abuse she was suffering. I'm on parole now. I can work during the day, but I have to return to the penitentiary at night." Each word cost her a piece of her soul, a slice of her dignity already so tattered by life, but the image of Sophie waiting at home with renewed hope gave her strength to continue her desperate search for a chance at a fresh start. A nearly imperceptible smile played on Constance's perfectly painted lips, not one of understanding or empathy, but of cruel triumph at finding exactly what she was looking for. "I understand perfectly, Helen. Motherhood turns us into beasts when our young are threatened." Her voice exuded a false solidarity that masked the cold calculation she was now making. A former convict on parole would be the perfect sacrificial lamb, easily framed, without credibility to defend herself, a disposable piece on the board of her deadly game. "I'm willing to give you this opportunity. You'll start tomorrow. My housekeeper will show you your duties and the room where you can rest between shifts. I'll occasionally need you to work evening events with special permission from the penitentiary, something I can arrange with my contacts." The following weeks unfolded at a carefully orchestrated pace by Constance, who observed Helen from a distance, studying her movements, her habits, her vulnerabilities, while simultaneously preparing the stage for her final act. The date chosen to eliminate Captain Montgomery was not accidental: the great annual Whitmore Charity Ball, an event that brought together the cream of society and local authorities in a display of false charity that served more to polish the family's public image than to effectively help those in need. Helen would work at the party, serving the guests perfectly visible to everyone, while Constance executed her plan with the precision of a maestro conducting her macabre symphony. The ballroom shone under the light of hundreds of candles and crystals, transforming the environment into a kaleidoscope of wealth and power that dazzled the eyes and dulled judgment. Helen moved among the guests like a shadow, invisible to those who saw her only as an extension of the silver trays she carried. Her eyes, however, could not help but admire the almost unreal beauty of that world, to which she would never belong. The women in their dresses that cost more than she would earn in an entire lifetime, the men whose casual words decided the fate of companies and, consequently, of thousands of workers like her. In one corner of the ballroom near the orchestra playing classical melodies, Daniel conversed animatedly, his restless eyes and nervous movements revealing to those who knew the signs that, even on this night, he was not completely sober. "Ah, Captain Montgomery, what an honor to have your presence at our modest celebration." Constance's voice rose above the murmur of conversations as the man she had sworn to destroy her son entered the hall. Her beaming smile concealed the visceral hatred she felt, as well as the undetectable poison she had hidden in the small ampule inside the ring she wore on her right index finger. "Come, let me personally serve you our special champagne. It is a rare vintage, reserved only for our most illustrious guests." Her arm intertwined with the captain's with calculated familiarity, leading him away from curious ears, towards the drink table strategically positioned in a more secluded corner of the ballroom. The moment that followed was a masterpiece of dissimulation. While distracting the captain with comments about the charitable cause of the evening, Constance skillfully poured the colorless and odorless contents of the ampule into the crystal glass, the poison mixing perfectly with the effervescent liquid. To justice, she toasted with irony that only she understood, watching with almost sexual satisfaction the moment when the man brought the glass to his lips and took a long sip of death disguised as celebration. The first signs were subtle: a growing pallor, beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cooled environment, a progressive difficulty in articulating words. The captain tried to reach for his phone, but his movements were already too uncoordinated. "I think I'm not feeling well," he managed to blurt out before his knees gave way and his body fell heavily onto the polished marble, provoking horrified screams from nearby guests. The ensuing chaos was precisely what Constance had planned. The confusion allowed her to approach Helen, who observed the scene paralyzed like everyone else, and discreetly slip into the pocket of her uniform the empty vial that had once contained the poison, now marked with the employee's fingerprints carefully collected from glasses and silverware over the previous weeks. "Helen, quick, bring water for the captain," she ordered out loud, ensuring that several witnesses registered the presence of the maid near the victim at the crucial moment. The paramedics arrived with impressive speed, but the poison had already done irreversible damage. Captain Montgomery was declared dead 3 hours later at the hospital, victim of what doctors initially classified as a fulminant heart attack. It would only be a matter of time before the autopsy revealed the truth, and when it did, the investigators did not have to look far to find the incriminating vial in Helen's room, along with other evidence meticulously planted by Constance. A falsified letter where the captain supposedly threatened to expose a secret relationship, newspaper clippings about the case that had led Helen to prison, and the remaining poison hidden among her few belongings. "Helen Carter, you are under arrest for the murder of Captain James Montgomery," announced the investigator, who barged into the small apartment where Helen had just arrived after another day of work at the mansion. The shock on her face as the officers handcuffed her in front of a terrified Sophie was genuine. The utter incomprehension of someone who, once again, found herself entangled in a web of injustice greater than her capacity to understand. From the window of her room in the Whitmore mansion, Constance watched the full moon with the serenity of one who had successfully completed an arduous task. Her son was safe, the captain eliminated, and a convenient culprit awaited trial. "Sacrifices must be made, my son," she whispered to herself, her fingers caressing Daniel's portrait that she always kept close. "But no one will ever touch you as long as I live." The grey walls of the women's penitentiary rose like monuments to human desolation, blocking not only the physical freedom of its inhabitants, but also any ray of hope that dared to penetrate that realm of shadows and regrets. In the inner courtyard, where the sky appeared only as a distant rectangle framed by concrete and barbed wire, Helen walked with her head bowed among other inmates, her orange uniform standing out like a flame of shame that consumed her from within, devouring the few fragments of dignity she had managed to reconstruct during her brief period of parole. Her eyes, once illuminated by the promise of a fresh start with her daughter, were now opaque, like frosted panes of glass, unable to reflect any light beyond the internal shadows that tormented her day and night since she had been again torn from her home under incomprehensible accusations of a crime she had never committed. The metallic sound of the gates opening announced visiting hours, causing her heart to painfully accelerate against her ribs, like a caged bird that still insists on flapping its wings, even knowing that flight is impossible. Her hands, trembling like autumn leaves about to detach from the branches, nervously adjusted her disheveled hair, while her eyes anxiously sought among the visitors entering the communal hall that face which was her only anchor in the whirlwind of despair that threatened to drown her. Sophie. The 14-year-old girl crossed the space with hesitant steps, her adolescent body seeming to shrink under the intimidating gazes of the guards and the overwhelming weight of that claustrophobic environment that had already stolen her mother once and now threatened to take her away forever. "Mommy!" The word escaped Sophie's lips like a whispered prayer, laden with so much emotion that it seemed to materialize in the air between them, dense and palpable, like the mist that precedes devastating storms. Her eyes, faithful mirrors of Helen's, were swollen and reddened from crying, the deep under-eye circles betraying sleepless nights since her mother's sudden imprisonment. "They said horrible things about you in the newspapers, on television, that you poisoned a captain, that they found evidence in our apartment. Aunt Margaret tries to protect me, hide the news, but I hear the neighbors talking. I see how they look at me on the street now." The embrace that followed was desperate, like castaways clinging to each other amid the relentless fury of the ocean, their bodies shaking with sobs that seemed to tear pieces from their souls. Helen cradled her daughter's face in her calloused hands, forcing herself to maintain composure as she wiped away crystalline tears that traced paths of pain on the young face that had once radiated only innocence and joy. "Listen to me carefully, Sophie." Her voice wavered between firmness and fragility, like a tightrope over an abyss of despair. "I did not kill that man. I had never even conversed with Captain Montgomery beyond formal greetings during the event at the mansion. I have no idea how those things ended up in our apartment or why someone would do this to me, to us." Sophie wiped away the tears with the sleeve of her worn coat, a gift Helen had bought in better times, when parole seemed the beginning of a new life instead of just a cruel interlude between convictions. Her eyes, now dry, acquired a startling determination for someone so young, as if each shed tear had washed away childlike innocence to reveal an inner strength she herself didn't know she possessed. "I know, Mom. I never doubted you for a second. You're not capable of killing anyone, not even Dad when he deserved it." Her voice grew hushed, almost a conspiratorial whisper. "There's something wrong with this whole story. Why would Mrs. Whitmore hire someone with a criminal record if she didn't have ulterior motives? Why would the very captain threatening her son die during a party at the mansion? It can't be a coincidence." Helen felt a chill run down her spine like an icy serpent as she heard the perspicacity in her daughter's words. For the first time since her arrest, she considered the possibility that her hiring had not been an act of kindness or a second chance, but part of a meticulously orchestrated plan. "Sophie, listen carefully." Her voice was now only an urgent murmur, as her eyes nervously checked if any guard was watching too closely. "I don't want you to get involved in this. The Whitmores are powerful people, with connections everywhere. If they set me up, you could put yourself in danger. Promise me you'll stay with Aunt Margaret, go to school, and wait for my public defender to try to prove my innocence." The bitter laugh that escaped Sophie's lips sounded strangely adult, out of place on that face that should only know the carefree smiles of youth. "Your public defender? That man who barely knows your name and juggles 20 other cases at the same time. Mom, if I don't do anything, you're going to be convicted again for something you didn't do." And this time, her voice faltered, unable to utter the words that hovered between them like sinister specters: "The death penalty. Don't ask me to stand by and watch you be punished unjustly again. I can't lose you again. I wouldn't bear it." Across town, sheltered by the mantle of privilege and opulence that the Whitmore mansion represented, Constance glided through the sumptuous hallways like the undisputed queen of her private domain. Her designer heels echoed across the polished marble like triumphant tolls announcing her victory over the system, over justice, over any obstacle that dared threaten her son's freedom. On her face, makeup perfected to conceal any sign of age or remorse, lingered a subtle smile of satisfaction, the expression of a predator savoring prey taken down with impeccable precision. Daniel's quarters, decorated like a five-star hotel suite, but with the chaotic disarray of one who never needed to organize his own space, exuded the decadent scent of privilege without responsibility. Imported liquor bottles vied for space with colorful pills on noble wood tables, while designer clothes lay strewn across the floor like discarded skins of a superficial existence. Constance found her son reclined in his favorite armchair, his glazed gaze fixed on the state-of-the-art television, displaying news about the arrest of the murderous maid who had poisoned the captain during a charity event. "We made it, my son," Constance announced, her melodious voice carrying the perverse pride of one who overcame every obstacle, no matter the means. "Captain Montgomery is no longer a threat. That woman, Helen, will be tried and convicted for his murder. The evidence is irrefutable. The poison found among her belongings, the fabricated motive, her fingerprints on the vial. They even did a reenactment, showing how she could have slipped the poison into his drink during the party." Her fingers caressed her son's unkempt hair, as she did when he was a child, a maternal gesture now masking the monstrosity of her recent actions. "Our name is clear of any suspicion. No one would ever think the philanthropist Constance Whitmore would eliminate a public servant in her own home." Daniel raised his gaze to his mother, his bloodshot eyes reflecting not gratitude or relief, but a disturbing emptiness that not even the substances he compulsively consumed could fill. "And her daughter?" he suddenly asked, surprising Constance with an unusual display of empathy, or perhaps just substance-induced paranoia. "The maid talked about her constantly. What will happen to the girl now that her mother is in prison?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, momentarily destabilizing Constance's triumphant certainty. For a fleeting instant, something akin to guilt flashed across her calculating eyes, not for the captain whose life she had reaped without remorse, nor for the servant whose freedom and reputation she had destroyed without hesitation, but for the innocent girl, collateral damage of her relentless crusade to protect Daniel. "It is not our problem, son," she replied at last, her voice regaining the aristocratic steadiness that characterized her. "We must only concern ourselves with our own family. That girl surely has other relatives, or the state will care for her. The important thing is that you are now safe." Constance adjusted the silk shawl over her shoulders, smoothing non-existent wrinkles with hands that had orchestrated the destruction of lives without trembling. "But listen closely, Daniel." Her voice assumed a tone of stern warning, maternal in its uncompromising authority. "This sacrifice I have made cannot be in vain. There will be no second chance, no other captain who can be eliminated. You need to stop with the drugs, the debts, and the self-destructive behavior. I have arranged a job for you at your father's company, starting Monday. It's time to take on responsibilities as the heir to the Whitmore empire." What Constance failed to perceive, in her unshakable certainty of triumph, was the fleeting shadow that crossed Daniel's face, not of submission or agreement, but of something more complex and potentially dangerous. As his mother left the room, satisfied with her own criminal ingenuity, the young heir once again directed his gaze towards the television, where Helen's face appeared in a court-file photo. His fingers drummed nervously against the armchair, while his dilated pupils fixed on the image of the woman whose fate his mother had sealed with the coldness of one signing an inconsequential check. "The daughter," he murmured to himself, words barely audible that were lost in the opulent silence of the mansion. "The daughter won't give up so easily." The relentless rain lashed the city streets like celestial tears shed for the innocent suffering earthly injustices, drenching Sophie's dark hair as she moved like a determined shadow among the grey buildings of the central precinct. Her hands, small but already marked by premature calluses of one who had known the weight of adult responsibility too early, clutched against her chest the school notebook where she meticulously noted every crumb of information she could extract about her mother's case. Scattered fragments she refused to believe could not form a revealing mosaic of the truth. Her eyes, ever vigilant like those of a cornered fox, caught details that many adults overlooked. The averted gaze of a police officer when mentioning the Whitmore name, the sudden silence of the courthouse janitors when she asked about the family's influence in the city, the way doors literally closed in her face when she tried to question the suspiciously convenient circumstances of Captain Montgomery's death. The past 10 days had been a painful pilgrimage through the labyrinthine corridors of police and judicial bureaucracy, where her youth was used as an excuse to ignore her questions, and her now tainted surname served as an invisible barrier, keeping her away from any useful information. "Go home, little girl. This is no business for children," they repeated to her with maddening condescension, as if her 14 years made her incapable of understanding the gravity of the situation or the imminence of the threat looming over her mother. Aunt Margaret, though loving in her support, also tried to dissuade her, apprehensive about the dangers the young girl faced by defying the city's powerful. "My little one," the elderly lady would say while serving hot soup on the cold nights when Sophie returned drenched and frustrated, "there are monsters in this city against which we cannot fight. Some have justice in their pockets like coins for parking." In the third week of her solitary investigation, Sophie realized she was being followed. It wasn't paranoia or a vivid imagination. There really was a dark car that appeared with unsettling frequency in the places where she asked questions, always keeping a calculated distance, but present like a silent sentinel sent to monitor her movements. The previous morning, she had found an anonymous note under the apartment door, whose meticulously disguised handwriting conveyed a message as clear as crystal in its veiled threat. "Curious children tend to get hurt. Your mother wouldn't want you to get hurt, too." The threat, instead of intimidating her, only intensified her determination, like dry kindling tossed onto the fire of her stubbornness. That note was confirmation that her questions were bothering someone, and innocent people are rarely bothered by questions about the truth. It was on a particularly frustrating afternoon, after being practically thrown out of the local newspaper's reception for trying to contest the biased reporting on her mother's case. That fate, that unpredictable dramatist who writes impossible scenes in life's narrative, brought Michael Reed into her path. The 38-year-old man, whose face marked by deep lines of one who had witnessed too much and smiled too little, carried the weight of 2 decades pursuing uncomfortable truths, watched Sophie from the newsroom's door. His gaze was not one of irritation like the security guards who escorted her out, nor of pity like the passers-by who witnessed the scene, but of genuine professional curiosity, like one who recognizes in another's determination the reflection of one's own obstinacy. "You're Helen Carter's daughter, aren't you?" he asked, his deep voice carrying the hoarseness characteristic of those who work under the constant pressure of relentless deadlines and elusive truths. "I've been trying to speak with a family member since I started investigating the case. I believe there are serious inconsistencies in the official version." Those words, so simple in their structure but revolutionary in their meaning, pierced Sophie's soul like rays of sun breaking through storm clouds after weeks of darkness. For the first time since her mother's arrest, someone other than her questioned the perfectly packaged narrative that the police and newspapers had sold to the public. Her eyes, which had long seemed to have forgotten how to shine, lit up with the rekindled flame of hope as she looked at the journalist with a mixture of instinctive distrust and desperation for an ally. "Why would you care?" she questioned, her voice carrying the premature bitterness of one who had learned too early that adults' interest rarely came without a hidden price. "All the other journalists have already condemned my mother before even the trial. Your newspaper published that horrible story calling her the poisoner, with a picture of her handcuffed, like some kind of monster." Michael indicated a modest cafe across the street, moving away from the curious ears at the newspaper's reception. "I don't work for this newspaper," he explained as they walked away, his tone lending the words the gravity of an important confession. "I'm an investigative freelancer for the monthly magazine Exposed Truth. I'm investigating a series of interesting coincidences involving the Whitmore family." He ordered 2 hot chocolates when they settled at the table furthest from the small establishment, and then, in a gesture that surprised Sophie, he lowered himself to her eye level, eliminating the physical barrier that adults unconsciously impose on children by speaking from above. "You know, Sophie," he said with a respectful seriousness she had never experienced from an adult since her father's abandonment, "in my profession, I've learned that children often see things adults ignore. Their eyes aren't clouded by social conveniences or fear of losing privileges. Tell me exactly what you heard and saw in that house." The hot chocolate cooled untouched, as Sophie, initially hesitant but progressively more fluent, shared her observations about the Whitmore mansion. She described how Constance seemed strangely interested in knowing Helen's routine, asking questions about where she lived, who she lived with, details about her probation that didn't seem relevant for a simple employer-employee relationship. She mentioned the heated arguments she'd overheard between Daniel and his mother about Captain Montgomery in the days leading up to the fatal event. She spoke about how Constance had specifically insisted that Helen serve in the area where the captain would be, despite other employees having more experience. And finally, With a voice trembling with pent-up emotion, she told about the evidence found in their apartment, a place where Helen barely spent enough time to sleep, let alone plan murders or hide evidence. "My mother barely knew who the captain was before working in that house," she concluded, silent tears sliding down her cheeks like translucent pearls of pain and indignation. Why would she kill him? What would be the motive? She was finally rebuilding our lives. Why would she risk everything? Michael didn't interrupt once, his notebook quickly filling with detailed notes, his watchful eyes capturing not only Sophie's words, but also the genuine emotions behind them. There was none of the typical adult condescension when listening to children, nor the haste to dismiss her as an unreliable source due to her youth. On the contrary, his subsequent questions demonstrated that he took each of her observations as seriously as he would those of any adult source. "You mentioned Daniel had issues with the captain. Can you remember exactly what you heard in those arguments? Any mention of drugs or investigations?" he inquired, leaning slightly forward, his eyes conveying the intensity of someone who senses the distant scent of truth. "And about Constance's behavior during the party. Did you notice anything out of the ordinary before the captain fell ill? Any moment when she was alone with him?" Night had already enveloped the city in its dark cloak when they finally left the cafe, Sophie feeling simultaneously exhausted and strangely energized, as if she had transferred part of the crushing weight she was carrying to Michael's broader, more experienced shoulders. The journalist accompanied her to the building where she lived with Aunt Margaret since her mother's imprisonment, his vigilant eyes scanning the street for the mysterious car she had mentioned. "I have some leads to investigate based on what you told me," he explained, handing her a small card with his phone number. "There's a pattern here, Sophie. The captain isn't the first obstacle to conveniently disappear from Daniel Whitmore's path, just the most prominent. I'll need time to put all the pieces together, but I promise I won't give up until we uncover the truth." As the journalist's figure disappeared into the urban night's darkness, Sophie felt an almost forgotten emotion blossoming in her chest like a stubborn flower between concrete cracks: hope. Michael had not only believed her, but validated her suspicions, transforming them from childish theories into investigative hypotheses worthy of pursuit. She climbed the stairs of the old building with lighter steps than she had descended that morning, eager to share with Aunt Margaret that she had finally found someone willing to help. The apartment door, however, was ajar, a disturbing detail that immediately triggered alarms in her danger-aware mind. She pushed it open hesitantly, calling out the elderly woman's name with a voice strangled by sudden fear. The apartment, normally kept in impeccable order by Aunt Margaret's meticulousness, looked as if it had been hit by a relentless hurricane. Drawers ripped from their places lay emptied on the floor, the modest contents of the small residence scattered in deliberate chaos that indicated systematic search. In the center of the living room, like a macabre centerpiece, lay Sophie's school notebook where she kept her notes on the case, now with several pages torn out and a message written in large red letters big enough to be read from a distance. "Last warning." Aunt Margaret was lying near the couch, a visible bump on her wrinkled forehead, softly moaning as she tried to get up with the difficulty of her age-fragile bones. "There were 2 men," the old woman mumbled when Sophie ran to help her, terror evident in her tear and shock-blurred eyes. "They were looking for your notebooks, your notes. They said if you didn't stop asking questions, next time it wouldn't just be a push. They said your mother isn't the only one who can end up behind bars." Her wrinkled hands grasped Sophie's with surprising strength for someone her age, the urgency of her maternal fear transcending blood ties. "You need to stop, my girl. These people have no limits. What will we do now? Where will we go?" Sophie stared at the desecrated notebook, the explicit threats, the devastated apartment, all concrete evidence that her questions were bothering the right people, touching wounds they preferred to keep hidden. Her gaze drifted to the card Michael had given her, still secure in her pocket, and a resolution crystallized in her heart with the unbending hardness of diamonds forged under extreme pressure. Instead of terror, she now felt a fierce determination, as if each attempt to silence her only amplified her inner voice. "We're not going anywhere, Aunt Margaret," she responded with surprising tranquility, discordant with the chaos surrounding them. "They just made the biggest mistake possible." She picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card, her fingers no longer trembling but steady as her resolve. "Michael, something has happened that you need to see. I think we've just received confirmation that we're on the right track." And they're terrified. The imposing Forum of Justice rose against the grey sky like a marble temple dedicated to a relentless and blind deity. Its majestic columns, casting elongated shadows over the steps, where journalists and onlookers jostled to witness the outcome of the trial that had captured the attention of the entire city. Inside the main courtroom, where the air seemed heavy with the scent of polished wood and sealed fates, Helen Carter stood before the judge with the silent dignity of a martyr, awaiting the verdict everyone already anticipated. Her face, once illuminated by the newfound hope during her brief release on parole, was now marked by deep circles that told stories of sleepless nights in prison, while her frail body seemed to diminish within the orange uniform that labeled her guilty long before the judge's gavel struck for the last time, sealing her fate with the cold formality of the law. The public defender assigned to represent Helen moved with the evident discouragement of someone who knows they're fighting a lost battle even before it begins. His argument sounded hollow against the mountain of meticulously orchestrated evidence: the vial of poison with Helen's fingerprints, the witnesses who saw her serving the captain moments before his fatal collapse, the forged letter suggesting a soured conspiracy between her and the captain, and finally her criminal record that had her on parole. A status that rendered her word practically worthless against the Whitmore dynasty, whose immaculate reputation remained untouched, like an impregnable castle, protected not by walls, but by generations of influence and old money that corrupted the foundations of justice. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Samuel Wallace's voice reverberated through the courtroom like divine sentence, silencing even the anxious breathing of spectators who followed the judicial theater with the morbid avidity of those watching a train wreck in slow motion, unable to look away from the impending destruction. From the bench reserved for witnesses, Sophie felt her heart freeze in her chest, like a bird struck mid-flight, as her hands gripped Michael's with enough force to leave marks. The journalist, her sole anchor in that ocean of despair, who in the last few days had become not only an ally in the investigation, but an improvised protector since the attack on Aunt Margaret's apartment. "Yes, Your Honor," replied the jury foreman, a middle-aged man whose well-cut suit and rigid posture suggested someone too concerned with appearances to dare defy the unwritten but clearly defined script of that trial. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Helen Carter, guilty of first-degree murder against Captain James Montgomery." The words fell upon the courtroom like stones thrown against a mirror, shattering the last fragile barrier between hope and the abyss of reality. Helen staggered slightly but remained standing, her eyes instinctively seeking Sophie's like a compass, searching for north amid the devastating storm that had just swallowed her. On the other side of the courtroom, partially obscured by an elegant hat with a subtle veil that partially concealed her face, Constance Whitmore observed the scene with an impassive expression that perfectly masked the inner turmoil consuming her. Her eyes, cold as precious gems, followed every movement of the judge as he prepared to announce the sentence, her aristocratic fingers discreetly clutching the designer purse where she had tucked a silk handkerchief, not to dab at non-existent tears, but to press against her lips should emotion threaten to betray her carefully maintained composure. For a fleeting instant, when her gaze accidentally met Sophie's, something akin to guilt crossed her perfectly made-up face, like a dark cloud passing through a summer sky, casting a momentary shadow before being banished by the relentless sun of her maternal conviction. "Helen Carter," the judge's voice acquired the ritualistic solemnity reserved for moments of utmost gravity. "Considering the heinous nature of the crime, its evident premeditation, the defendant's criminal record, and her status as a repeat offender on parole, this court sentences you to the maximum penalty allowed by law. Death by electric chair. The sentence will be carried out 30 days from this date." The gavel fell with deafening finality, its impact reverberating through the hearts present like thunder, announcing Helen's personal apocalypse. A harrowing scream cut through the air like a sharp dagger, ripping through the membrane of formality surrounding the courtroom. "No, my mother is innocent." Sophie broke free from Michael's hands and ran towards her mother, knocking down the barrier, separating the audience from the defendants before the guards could stop her. Her arms enveloped Helen with the desperate strength of someone clinging to the last plank in a stormy sea, her abundant tears soaking the orange uniform as violent sobs shook her small body. "I know you didn't do it, Mum. We'll prove the truth, I swear on my life. I won't let them take you from me, not again." Helen, handcuffed and restrained by the guards already approaching to separate them, managed only to lean down and kiss her daughter's head one last time, her own eyes dry not from lack of pain, but from the fierce determination not to give the eager spectators the spectacle of her despair. "Be strong, my love," she whispered urgently as sentinel hands of the guards grabbed her shoulders to pull her away. "Always believe in the truth, even when no one else does. Even if the whole world says otherwise, stand firm in what you know is real." Her last words were almost inaudible as the guards dragged her toward the side door leading back to prison. "Go back to Aunt Margaret. Stay safe. Don't risk yourself for me." Constance watched the scene with an unruffled expression, although her heart raced beneath her impeccably tailored coat. Each sob from the girl, a small dagger piercing the armor of self-deception she had built to justify her actions. For a fleeting moment, doubt infiltrated her spirit like a drop of water finding a crack in the most solid concrete. Was her love for her son justification enough to completely destroy that family? Sophie's face, contorted by the purest pain she had ever witnessed, disturbingly mirrored what she herself would feel if Daniel were torn from her. The memory of her own son, however, quickly solidified her wavering resolve. "It's different," she whispered to herself as she rose to leave the courtroom before anyone noticed her presence. "Daniel is my only child, my own flesh and blood. Any sacrifice is justifiable to protect him." Outside the courthouse, under the fine rain that seemed to weep the tears that Helen had refused to shed, Michael held Sophie by the shoulders, forcing her to face him as his face crumbled into uncontrollable cascades of despair. "Sophie, listen to me," he spoke with a firmness that contrasted with the softness of his hands as he wiped away the tears that streamed relentlessly down the girl's cheeks. "It's not over yet. We have 30 days until the execution, 30 days to find the truth and overturn this conviction. I'm not giving up, do you understand? No matter how powerful the Whitmores are, no matter how many threats we receive. I promise on my honor that I won't rest until I prove your mother's innocence." Sophie's eyes, clouded by tears but burning with feverish determination, fixed themselves on Michael's, as if seeking to anchor themselves in the only promise that still had value in a world that was crumbling around her. "We need concrete evidence," she articulated between sobs that gradually transformed into steely resolution. "That prosecutor said that only a miracle or a confession would save my mother now. We need something that not even the Whitmore money can buy or hide." Her voice acquired a frightening maturity for her 14 years, as if each injustice suffered had forged an adult spirit within her still childlike body. "Michael, I have nothing left to lose. If we can't save my mother, I don't care what happens to me after." The journalist felt a chill run down his spine as he perceived the almost self-destructive intensity emanating from the girl, recognizing in her the same fire that had already consumed him in previous investigations when he had crossed dangerous lines in pursuit of the truth. "I have some contacts that can help us," he replied, guiding her away from the crowd of reporters that was beginning to form on the courthouse steps. "A former cop who worked with Montgomery and knows the cases he investigated, including those related to Daniel. And there's also a former Whitmore employee who was fired a few months ago and seems eager to talk. But we need to be extremely cautious now. The sentence makes everything more dangerous. They have nothing more to lose if we decide not to stop." Crossing the square in front of the courthouse, neither Sophie nor Michael noticed the black car, parked strategically under the shade of a leafy tree, nor the man of anonymous appearance who photographed their every move with a telephoto lens, meticulously documenting their conversation. Inside the vehicle, a cell phone rang with a discreet melody. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm observing them now. The journalist and the girl don't seem willing to give up even after the sentence." A pause as Constance's crystalline and authoritative voice conveyed precise instructions on the other end of the line. "Yes, ma'am. Understood. I will continue monitoring, but if they keep investigating, we eliminate the problem permanently." Night fell over the city like a heavy cloak of uncertainty. When Sophie and Michael arrived at the modest apartment, the journalist had turned into an improvised headquarters for his investigation. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, diagrams, and lines connecting people and events in a complex web whose center was the Whitmore family. "There's a pattern here," Michael explained, pointing to a series of photographs of seemingly unconnected people. "In the last 5 years, 7 people who posed threats to Daniel or the family's business died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Captain Montgomery is just the most prominent case, but not the first." His fingers traced a timeline where each incident was marked with journalistic meticulousness. "What we need is to find the indisputable connection, the proof that not even the most corrupt judge could ignore." Sophie observed the mural with an almost hypnotic intensity, her mind working 1,000 miles an hour, despite the emotional exhaustion of the day. "Daniel, she suddenly murmured, pointing to the photograph of Constance's son at the center of the diagram. He's the weakest link. The mother kills to protect him. But what if he no longer wants to be protected? What if he's tired of being the cause of so much destruction? Her eyes acquired the feverish gleam of sudden inspiration. Michael, we need to find Daniel when he's away from his mother. He may be our only chance. The journalist frowned, concern evident in every line of his exhaustion-marked face. It's extremely risky, Sophie. Daniel is unstable, addicted, and completely manipulated by his mother. Moreover, he would be incriminating himself if he confessed any knowledge about her crimes. He hesitated, clearly divided between the desperate need to find evidence and the protective instinct he had developed towards the girl. But you may be right. Maybe it's our only option at this point. Michael's cell phone rang suddenly, breaking the tension of the moment. His face visibly paled as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line, his eyes automatically seeking Sophie's in an expression that mixed shock and renewed urgency. I understand. Yes, thank you for the warning. I will take all precautions. He hung up slowly as if the weight of the device had suddenly multiplied and faced Sophie with a seriousness that made her blood run cold. It was my contact at the courthouse. Your mother's execution has been brought forward. We don't have 30 days anymore. Constance Whitmore used her influence to accelerate the process, citing urgent public interest in the final resolution of the case. Michael's modest apartment had transformed into an improvised fortress against the relentless time that slipped like fine sand through their desperate fingers. The once bare and anonymous walls now displayed an almost hypnotic mosaic of newspaper clippings, enlarged photographs, meticulously constructed timelines, and maps marked with colored pins that connected people, places, and events through crisscrossing yarn lines like giant spiderwebs, all converging on the magnetic center where the Whitmore family photograph rested, extracted from some society column. The kitchen table had become a chaotic office, buried under piles of documents, police reports obtained through anonymous sources, transcribed testimonies, and abandoned coffee cups whose long, cold contents silently bore witness to the sleepless nights that turned into mornings of deep under-eye circles and even more ingrained determination. The 5 days that had passed since Helen's conviction seemed simultaneously a fleeting instant and an eternity of mounting frustration, each wasted hour bringing them closer to the inevitable abyss of premature execution. Sophie now sat before Michael's computer, her youthful fingers typing urgently as her eyes absorbed every fragment of available information about Daniel Whitmore, studying his habits, his weaknesses, his self-destructive routines that might provide the necessary crack to pry loose the confession that would save her mother. Her face, where childhood and forced maturity wrestled for dominance, bore an almost supernatural concentration for someone her age, as if she had aged decades during those grueling weeks of trial. I found something interesting, Michael commented, entering the apartment with a worn folder under his arm, his disheveled hair and unkempt beard giving him the appearance of a castaway on an island of paper and obsession. A former Whitmore security guard finally agreed to talk to me. Though he refused any formal record of the conversation, he spread some hastily scribbled notes from his reporter's notebook on the table, pointing to names circled in red and underlined addresses. Daniel regularly frequents a location on the south outskirts where he meets his drug suppliers. It's an area practically abandoned by the authorities, which explains why someone of his social standing would feel safe there. According to my source, he usually appears on Tuesdays and Fridays, always after nightfall, supposedly without his mother's knowledge. Sophie absorbed the information with the avidity of a desert plant receiving water after months of drought, her eyes momentarily lighting up with the spark of hope that refused to die completely in her chest. The past few days had been a brutal exercise in patience as Michael taught her basic journalistic investigation techniques, how to organize information, identify patterns, distinguish facts from rumors, and most importantly, how to maintain enough emotional distance to see beyond the fog of feelings that could obscure crucial clues. The girl had proven a surprisingly apt learner, her young mind absorbing each lesson with an intensity that impressed even the veteran journalist, as if her mother's life literally depended on her ability to assimilate that knowledge, which in fact was true. This is our breakthrough point, Michael concluded, tracing concentric circles around the noted address, his mind already formulating strategies and assessing risks. Daniel is visibly unstable, increasingly dependent on substances to function. Sources close to the family mention that he has shown erratic behavior since the captain's death. alternating between excessive euphoria and bouts of paranoia. If we can approach him at the right moment, we might be able to extract a confession about his mother's involvement. His voice carried the restrained enthusiasm of someone who finally sees a path amidst the labyrinth, although the rational part of his mind continued calculating the minuscule probabilities of success against the Whitmores' almost unlimited power. The words hung in the air like a promise too fragile to bear the weight of hope Sophie tried to place in them. Suddenly, like a dam yielding under unbearable pressure, something broke inside the girl. Her shoulders, which had remained rigidly upright by sheer force of determination for days, sagged like branches overburdened by the relentless snow of winter. The tears, contained by pride and the need to appear strong, finally overflowed in uncontrollable cascades that washed her face in shining trails of crystalline despair. What if it's not enough? Her voice shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces that seemed to wound her own throat. What if we can't save my mother in time? The execution was moved up. I've already lost my father. He abandoned me when I needed him most. When my mother was first imprisoned, he simply disappeared, as if I were a burden not worth carrying. And now I'm going to lose my mother forever, because of a lie, because of rich and powerful people who can simply discard human lives like discarding a used napkin. Michael felt his heart painfully constrict within his chest at that outburst of raw vulnerability. At some point during those intense weeks, without realizing exactly when or how, this investigation had ceased to be just another case or story and had become a personal crusade. Sophie, with her courage disproportionate to the size of her teenage body and her fierce loyalty to her wronged mother, had penetrated the professional barriers he usually kept erected as protection against excessive emotional involvement. He knelt before her, his hands resting firmly on the fragile shoulders that trembled with the force of her sobs, gently forcing her to look at him. "Sophie, listen." His voice took on the solemn intensity of someone making not just a promise, but a sacred vow etched into his very soul. "I promise I won't give up on your mother. I won't abandon you, understood? We'll keep fighting until the very last second, until the last resort, until the last possibility. As long as there's time, there's hope." The silence that followed was filled only by the girl's gradually controlled sobs, her red and swollen eyes fixed on Michael's, as if seeking in them the confirmation that his words were not just empty consolation, but a true commitment. The journalist held that gaze unwavering, allowing Sophie to see through the window of his eyes the unshakable determination that burned within him. "Tomorrow I'll infiltrate that place where Daniel shows up," he explained with deliberate calm, still holding her shoulders as an anchor amid the emotional storm. "I've already talked to Rachel, my colleague from the magazine, and she agreed to stay with you during the days I need to get close to him. She has a safe apartment where no one will find you." Hours later, when the black mantle of midnight covered the sleeping city, Michael found Sophie finally surrendered to physical and emotional exhaustion, her teenage body curled up on the worn couch like a wounded animal seeking protection. He gently covered her with a threadbare but clean blanket, observing how sleep momentarily softened the lines of worry no 14-year-old girl should bear. "I'll protect you both," he vowed in an almost inaudible whisper, more to himself than to the sleeping girl, "no matter the cost." The oath hung in the air like an invisible contract, sealed between his conscience and the universe, witnessed only by the compassionate silence of the night. The following morning brought with it the crushing weight of reality and the relentless urgency of time running out. Rachel, a 40-year-old woman whose keen eyes had witnessed decades of injustice as a war photojournalist, welcomed Sophie into her apartment, fortified by security systems worthy of justified professional paranoia. "Don't worry about Michael," the girl reassured as she watched the journalist depart in his worn-out car, already transformed by meticulous characterization into an unrecognizable version of himself. "He has more lives than a cat and sharper instincts than a fox in hunter's territory. If anyone can extract a confession from Daniel Whitmore, it's him." The following 3 days were an excruciating exercise in patience for Sophie, confined in Rachel's apartment, while Michael delved into the sordid depths of the underworld that Daniel frequented. The journalist, unrecognizable under a false beard and deliberately aged clothes, mingled with the frequenters of that forgotten territory where misery and vice intertwined in perverse symbiosis. Each night was dedicated to building his character, establishing a presence that did not arouse suspicion, gradually approaching the restricted circle that orbited around the privileged son of the Whitmores, who appeared as a decadent monarch, distributing money and misery in equal parts among his destitute subjects. On the third night, Michael's persistence finally bore fruit. Daniel, more intoxicated than usual, allowed the false companion of vice to approach closely enough to engage in conversation that gradually migrated to lamentations about authorities and their interference in personal pleasures. The recorder, tiny and imperceptible in the torn pocket of Michael's jacket, captured every word as the journalist carefully guided the dialogue. "Police always persecuting those who just want to enjoy in peace," Michael commented in a conspiratorial tone, perfectly interpreting the role of a rebel against the system. "Especially those captains who think they own the truth, persecuting us as if they were saints." The comment triggered something inside Daniel, like a key finding the perfect lock to unleash the floodgates of imprudent confession. His eyes, bloodshot and feverish from the lethal combination of substances circulating in his blood, acquired an almost maniacal gleam as he leaned closer to Michael, as if about to share a precious secret. "Captains," he repeated with visceral contempt distilling from every syllable, "they think the badge makes them untouchable, that Montgomery thought he could threaten me, follow me, build a dossier on me as if I were any common vagabond." He laughed abruptly, a harsh sound devoid of any genuine joy. "But you know what happens to those who mess with me? My mother does anything for me. Anything, understand? She even took out of circulation that captain who was threatening me. She's incredible, man, incredible." He beat his chest with bizarre pride, like a child boasting of his parents' power, except that in this case, the power manifested itself through premeditated murder. Michael felt his pulse accelerate dizzily in the face of that explicit confession, aware that he had just captured the proof that could save Helen from the imminent execution scheduled for the following day. He continued the conversation for a few more minutes, extracting additional details that solidified the confession before inventing an excuse to move away, claiming a need to find his supplier. He casually walked away, controlling the urge to run towards the car parked 3 blocks away, aware that sudden movements could arouse suspicion even among minds dulled by various substances. Only when he was at a safe distance, his heart still pounding against his ribs like a prisoner trying to escape, did Michael allow himself a brief sigh of relief. The recording in his pocket was pure dynamite, capable of exploding the meticulously constructed charade of the Whitmores. He started the car with slightly trembling hands from the receding adrenaline, eager to return to Rachel's apartment and share the victory with Sophie. The execution was scheduled for the following day at noon. There was still enough time to bring the evidence to the proper authorities and force the suspension of the proceedings. What Michael did not realize in his state of contained euphoria from the crucial achievement was the man of anonymous appearance who watched him from across the street, speaking discreetly on the phone while memorizing the license plate of the departing car. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think we have a problem. Your son has just had a long conversation with a suspicious man who does not belong to the usual circle. I managed to take pictures. I'm sending them to your cell phone now." A brief pause while he listened to precise instructions. "Yes, ma'am, immediately, understood." The wheels of destiny, relentless in their perpetual rotation, were now accelerating towards the inevitable collision between truth and power, innocence and guilt, justice and privilege. On the invisible scale of the universe, 2 mothers occupied opposite plates, both willing to sacrifice everything for their children, albeit through diametrically opposed paths. The night advanced silently, indifferent to the human drama unfolding under its starry mantle, while the recorder in Michael's pocket continued to register every bump in the road, unaware that its precious content had simultaneously become salvation and death sentence. The night enveloped the city in its penumbra, as the Whitmore's private driver steered the limousine through the empty streets, carrying a Constance whose aristocratic countenance could no longer hide the fissures of maternal despair that crossed her soul. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the cell phone with disproportionate force, the images sent by the private security guard revealing her son Daniel in intimate conversation with a suspicious stranger, casting threatening shadows over the castle of lies she had so meticulously constructed. Her eyes scrutinized every alley, every corner of that degraded territory where her heir sought refuge in prohibited substances, while her heart beat with the devastating force of fear, not for herself, but for the terrible possibility that her entire criminal architecture might crumble before the last witness was permanently silenced by the justice she herself had corrupted. "There, ma'am," the driver indicated, pointing to a staggering figure emerging from an abandoned building, Daniel's aristocratic features almost unrecognizable under the distorted mask that vice imposed on his once handsome face. Constance did not wait for the vehicle to come to a complete stop before flinging herself out, her designer heels echoing on the broken sidewalk like the hammering of fate inexorably approaching. "Daniel!" Her voice crossed the distance between them like an arrow poisoned by panic. "What have you done? Who are you talking to?" She grabbed her son's arms with the surprising strength of despair, her feverish eyes searching his face for some spark of lucidity amidst the chemical labyrinth where his mind wandered. Daniel stared at his mother with bloodshot eyes that seemed not to fully recognize her, a crooked smile distorting his parched lips as he allowed himself to be led into the limousine like a puppet whose strings had been cut, his head lolling back against the leather upholstery as he mumbled disconnected words. "That new guy. I liked him, Mom," he slurred amid a humorless laugh that froze Constance's blood in her veins. "I told him how amazing you are, how you take care of me, how you even killed that damn captain who wanted to hurt me." His drunken words fell into the luxurious interior of the vehicle like weapons of mass destruction, each syllable detonating explosions of panic in the matriarch's heart as she now grasped the catastrophic magnitude of what had just happened. At the very moment Constance ordered the driver to return to the mansion immediately, on the other side of town, Michael frantically parked his car in front of Rachel's apartment, the recorder clutched to his chest like a sacred relic containing an innocent's salvation. Sophie waited at the window, her teenage body taut as a violin string about to snap from the pressure of the past few weeks of anguish and anticipation. When the journalist burst through the door, his face alight with a victory that had seemed almost impossible just hours before, the girl knew even before he spoke that they had secured the proof that could save her mother from imminent death. "I confessed, Sophie," Michael exclaimed, connecting the recorder to a small speaker as Rachel approached to listen. "Daniel confessed that Constance killed the captain to protect him. We have it all recorded word for word. The nightmare is over." Speeding recklessly across town, the three headed to the newspaper where Michael occasionally published, convinced that the media's power of exposure could pressure authorities to suspend the execution scheduled for 2 days later. The editor-in-chief, 50-year-old Richard Salazar, whose face bore the marks of decades witnessing power corrupt truth, listened to the recording in his closed office, his expression gradually darkening like the sky before a devastating storm. "Impossible to publish this," he ultimately ruled, shutting off the recorder with an abrupt motion that symbolized his final verdict. "The Whitmores are this newspaper's main sponsors. Constance herself funds our culture section and sits on the administrative board. She would destroy us before the ink dried on the pages. We'll sue the paper into bankruptcy if they dare suggest she's involved in a murder." "I'm sorry, Michael, but I can't risk the jobs of 200 employees." The words fell upon them like marble tombstones, sealing hope in premature graves. Sophie felt the ground vanish beneath her feet, the cruel reality of unequal power, manifesting in all its ruthless brutality. It was at this moment of utter despair that Michael's phone rang, bringing news that transformed the abyss into an even deeper precipice. A contact in the prison system reported that, through rarely used emergency procedures, Helen's execution had been inexplicably moved up to noon the next day, less than 14 hours from that moment. Constance must have found out about the recording, Michael concluded, understanding the mortal urgency that now governed every second. "She's using all her influence to silence Helen before we can prove her innocence." As they left the newspaper office under the editor's constrained but unwavering gaze, Sophie finally allowed terror to overtake her completely, her body trembling like a leaf in the wind as desperate tears washed her youthful face, marked by too many adult pains. "It was all for nothing," she sobbed, clinging to the stair railing as if it were the last support in a crumbling world. "My mother is going to die tomorrow, and all our efforts weren't enough against that cursed family's power." Michael knelt before her, holding her face between his hands with a gentle firmness that conveyed more than words could express. "We can't give up now," he declared with a fierce intensity that lit his eyes like beacons in utter darkness. "We'll take this straight to the prison warden. If he hears this recording, he'll have legal grounds to suspend the execution pending a new investigation." He pulled Sophie against his chest, feeling her tears soak his shirt as he silently vowed to move heaven and earth in the coming hours. "I promised I wouldn't abandon you, remember? We're going to save your mother together, even if we have to knock down those prison gates with our bare hands." What none of them knew as they raced against dwindling time was that at that very moment, Constance Whitmore was signing official documents in her private office, a cold smile of triumph curving her perfectly painted lips as she glanced at the wall clock, each ticking second bringing her closer to the security that would only come when Helen was dead and the secret forever buried in her anonymous grave. "Tomorrow it will all be over," she whispered to herself, unaware that her supposedly unconscious son in the adjacent room was in fact awake, listening to every word as silent tears of guilt and remorse began, too late, to form in his troubled eyes. The cold and impersonal light of the neon buzzed like metallic insects trapped on the ceiling of the special cell, where Helen awaited the final minutes of her earthly existence, now counted not in days or hours, but in precious breaths that she tried to draw with the intensity of someone who knows that each one could be the last. Her body, stripped of the usual orange uniform and now dressed in the pale grey gown reserved for the condemned, seemed smaller and more fragile, as if already beginning to detach itself from materiality to begin its journey into the unknown. The guards had shaved a small part of her head, preparing the spot where the fatal electrodes would be connected, a macabre ritual of preparation for the sacrifice that the state would perform in the name of a justice corrupted by money and influence. Her gaze, however, maintained a disconcerting serenity that unsettled even the most experienced guards, accustomed to witnessing despair, pleas, last-minute confessions that often preceded the final moment. Father Thomas, an elderly man whose eyes had witnessed decades of human suffering in his mission to offer spiritual comfort to the condemned, now sat before Helen, his wrinkled hands holding hers through the small opening in the grate that separated them. "God knows the truth, my daughter," he murmured with a voice choked by emotion that he could never completely suppress, even after so many years in that somber role. "The justice of men is fallible, but the divine court sees beyond appearances, beyond lies, beyond the power that corrupts earthly hearts." His words, though uttered with moving sincerity, seemed to float in the rarefied air of the cell like soap bubbles, beautiful, ephemeral, incapable of altering the brutal reality that was approaching with the inevitability of the tides. The last meal, a simple plate of rice, beans, and a small piece of chicken, which Helen had requested not out of appetite, but because she knew it was Sophie's favorite, remained practically untouched on the metal tray. Instead of eating, she dedicated her final moments to writing a letter to her daughter, each word carefully chosen, each sentence laden with the infinite love that would transcend death and physical separation. "My beloved Sophie," she wrote with trembling but determined calligraphy, "when you read these words, I will no longer be in this world, but my love for you will continue to exist in each dawn you witness, in each star that shines in the night sky, in every beat of your courageous heart. Never, not for a second, believe that I was guilty of the crime for which they condemn me. I die innocent, a victim of a system that protects the powerful and sacrifices the defenseless. But I do not want you to harbor hatred or seek revenge. That would only consume the light you carry within you, the same light that illuminated my darkest days in this prison." In the outer corridors of the prison, Michael faced the relentless bureaucracy that seemed deliberately created to prevent the truth from arriving in time to save an innocent life. His press pass, normally sufficient to ensure access to government institutions, encountered unusual resistance on that fateful morning. "Special order from the management," explained the guard with an impenetrable expression, avoiding eye contact like someone who knows they are complicit in an injustice greater than their comprehension allows them to accept. "No journalists are authorized to attend the procedure. It's a closed execution." By Michael's side, Sophie struggled against the tears that threatened to blind her vision, her hands gripping tightly the small recorder that contained the only hope of salvation for her mother. So physically close and yet separated by seemingly insurmountable barriers of concrete, steel, and bureaucracy. "Please," Sophie begged, her voice broken by the desperation that grew exponentially with every minute the clock advanced towards noon. "It's my mother. She's innocent. We have the proof right here." She raised the recorder as if it were a sacred talisman, her flooded eyes fixed on the guard, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. It was at this critical moment that Grace, a 33-year-old prison officer, who had been observing the scene from the internal control post, felt something break inside her chest, like a dam yielding under unbearable pressure. She approached with determined steps, her impeccable uniform contrasting with the emotional storm that now stirred within her. "I'll handle this, Sergio," she declared to the guard with an authority that admitted no questioning, although her heart pounded against her ribs like a drum announcing an imminent revolution. She led Michael and Sophie to a side room, quickly closing the door behind them. "I have only one daughter your age," she confessed to Sophie, her eyes revealing the internal battle between professional duty and the moral conscience that now tore her apart. "I've already witnessed 3 executions since I've worked here, and I've always wondered if any of those people were really innocent. I've never been able to sleep well after the first one." She hesitated for only an instant, looking at the clock that showed 11:45 in the morning, before making the decision that could cost her her job, but would save her soul. "The journalist can officially enter with me as an administrative companion. As for you, girl, there's a service entrance that leads directly to the execution wing. It's risky, but I can take you there." Meanwhile, in the execution chamber, a room aseptically prepared where death was administered with the cold efficiency of a medical procedure, Helen was led by the guards to the massive wooden chair with its leather straps and metal apparatuses that seemed to come from a modernized medieval nightmare. Director Harris, a man whose career in the prison system had left deep marks on his austere face, personally supervised the procedure, his countenance bearing the institutional weight of one who carries out orders without allowing himself to question their fundamental justice. Beside him, the responsible physician checked the equipment with robotic precision, while the small audience of official witnesses, mostly state employees obliged by protocol to witness the act, maintained a silence laden with palpable tension. "Helen Carter," announced the director with a voice that tried to remain neutral, although a slight tremor betrayed his internal disturbance. "You have been convicted of the murder of Captain James Montgomery and sentenced to death by electrocution in accordance with a final judicial decision. Do you have any final statement before the execution of the sentence?" His eyes momentarily averted from Helen's, as if he feared finding in them an inconvenient truth too much to bear. Helen, already seated in the chair as the guards began to buckle the straps around her wrists and ankles, raised her face with a dignity that contrasted violently with the degrading situation in which she found herself. "I die innocent," she declared in a clear voice that reverberated off the walls of the chamber like an accusation against all present. "And although you execute my body today, the truth about this crime will not die with me. One day it will come to light, and all who participated in this farce will have to answer before their own consciences." Her eyes, dry and intense, scanned the uncomfortable faces of the witnesses, as if marking them individually, eternizing them as accomplices to a historical injustice. The technician responsible approached with the wet sponge that would be placed against her scalp to facilitate the conduction of the lethal current, when suddenly the side door was thrown open with thunderous violence. Sophie burst into the room like a hurricane of desperate determination, her disheveled hair and wide eyes fixed on her mother, already partially strapped to the death chair. "Stop! My mother is innocent. I have proof." Her scream tore through the procedural silence of the room like a lightning bolt cutting across a storm sky, freezing everyone present in their places like salt statues before the unexpected. Chaos erupted instantly. Guards advanced to detain the teenager, while Michael emerged through the same door accompanied by Grace, whose expression oscillated between professional terror and moral determination. Director Harris, recovering from the initial shock, authoritatively raised his hand to stop the guards. "What invasion is this? How did a minor gain access to the execution chamber?" His voice carried official indignation that barely masked genuine disturbance at the surreal scene unfolding. "Director, please," Michael intervened, advancing with the recorder extended as tangible evidence amid the emotional chaos. "We have here the confession of Constance Whitmore's son, admitting that his mother murdered Captain Montgomery to protect him. Helen Carter is completely innocent, framed by a powerful woman who never imagined her scheme would be uncovered." The journalistic authority in his voice contrasted with the tears now freely running down his face, betraying the emotional involvement that transcended any pretense of professional detachment. Sophie managed to break free from the guards and ran to the chair where her mother remained strapped, her desperate fingers trying to undo the restraints that bound her, while violent sobs shook her teenage body. "Mom, we did it. We have the proof." He confessed everything. Helen, still dazed by the impossible turnaround she was witnessing, could only repeat her daughter's name as a prayer of gratitude to the heavens that had finally intervened. Director Harris, after a moment's hesitation that seemed to stretch into eternity, extended his hand for the recorder Michael was offering. "Pause the procedure," he ordered, with an authority that immediately silenced everyone present. "No one touch anything else until we evaluate this alleged evidence." He connected the device to a loudspeaker available in the adjacent control room, and Daniel Whitmore's intoxicated but unmistakable voice filled the chamber, his incriminating words echoing off the walls like a sentence now turned against its true culprits. My mum does anything for me. I even took out that captain who was threatening me. She's incredible, man. The silence that followed the recording had physical weight, as if the air in the room had solidified around them. The director, his face pale as wax, finally broke the morbid spell. "Release her immediately," he ordered the guards who seemed paralyzed by the revelation. "The execution is officially suspended. Contact the judge on call with utmost urgency and issue an arrest warrant for Constance Whitmore for aggravated homicide and obstruction of justice." As the guards hastily undid the chains binding Helen to the death chair, mother and daughter finally embraced with the desperate strength of those who survived an apocalyptic storm, their bodies trembling in unison as if they were a single momentarily divided being now reunified. Michael observed the scene from a distance, silent tears washing his face while Grace, by his side, discreetly squeezed his arm in a gesture of complicity and gratitude for having together prevented justice from being buried under the tombstone of corruption and privilege. What none of them could foresee, as they savored that moment of truth's triumph over lies, was that Constance Whitmore, upon receiving news of the suspended execution through her privileged contacts in the system, was already setting in motion her most desperate contingency plan, one that would not only threaten Helen's life again, but drag everyone involved into an even deeper abyss of danger and revelations. Spring arrived like a divine blessing after the relentless winter of injustices, spreading colors and fragrances of renewal through the streets of the neighborhood, where Helen and Sophie were now building their new life, brick by emotional brick, dream by recovered dream from the ashes of near destruction. The newly painted facade of the small Hands of Hope store stood out on the main avenue, with its vibrant colors and carefully arranged display windows exhibiting delicate handicrafts that told silent stories of resurrection and perseverance, techniques Helen had perfected during the long days in captivity, transforming pain into beauty with the alchemy that only true survivors can master. The $1 million compensation the state awarded after the Whitmore scandal came to light, revealing not only the captain's murder, but a corruption network spanning decades, allowed mother and daughter to finally breathe without the crushing weight of economic precariousness that had always pursued them like a relentless shadow. Sophie, now attending the city's most prestigious school thanks to the family's new financial condition, flourished like a plant that finally finds fertile soil and adequate light after surviving in arid terrain. Her eyes, which had once known only fear and hopelessness, now shone with the intensity of youth that could finally express itself, her teenage body freed from the constant tension that had previously kept it perpetually coiled like an animal always awaiting the next blow. At the store, she helped her mother in the afternoons, organizing handicraft workshops for underprivileged children, a social project Helen had insisted on implementing as a way to repay the universe for the second chance she had been given when all paths seemed to lead only to death. "Ladies, there's someone here to see you," announced Aunt Margaret, now an official employee of the store and a maternal figure who had refused to leave the two women's lives even after their change in circumstances, her loyalty rewarded with a position of trust in the enterprise. Her normally serene expression now displayed barely concealed disturbance, like a sky announcing a distant but inevitable storm. At the door, stopped like a materialized ghost from a past they had believed was definitively buried, was Robert, hair now graying at the temples, clothes that unsuccessfully tried to disguise years of self-neglect, eyes carrying a disconcerting mixture of genuine remorse and self-interested calculation in the face of evident prosperity. "Helen, Sophie, how different you look," he exclaimed, his voice choked with emotion, whose authenticity was impossible to fully determine, his eyes avidly absorbing every detail of the environment that betrayed financial comfort he had never expected to find. "I learned what happened, the terrible injustice, the compensation. I came to say that I am deeply sorry for having left you at that moment. I was lost, destroyed by the guilt of not having protected you. But I have changed, found steady work, stopped drinking completely. Perhaps we can try again, rebuild our family, erase the mistakes of the past that torment me every night." Helen's eyes, who had survived the death row and stared her own mortality in the face without blinking, hardened like obsidians polished by the fire of deepest indignation. Sophie instinctively positioned herself beside her mother, their bodies forming a physical and symbolic barrier against that intrusion that threatened to contaminate the peace they had conquered at such a high price. The silence stretched for seconds that seemed to dilate into minutes, laden with unspoken history, wounds that would never fully heal, betrayals that no belated repentance could erase. "You abandoned us when we needed you most," Helen finally pronounced, each word emerging crystalline and definitive, like a sentence carved in stone. "You left your daughter alone, helpless, as if she were a disposable object when she became inconvenient. Now you have no place in our life, Robert. We don't want your belated repentance or your sudden interest that miraculously coincides with our financial stability." Her eyes, which had once overflowed with love for that man, now pierced him with the relentless clarity of one who sees beyond the masks. "Our family is complete as it is. I ask that you respect our decision and do not return." The shop door opened again, giving way to Michael, who carried books and a laptop, tools for the study session he had planned with Sophie to help her with her school journalism project. Upon sensing the tension that hung in the environment like a dense fog, his body instinctively positioned itself protectively close to the two women who, without realizing it, had become his family of choice during the intense months they shared between despair and redemption. Robert immediately grasped the meaning of that presence, his eyes registering the evident comfort that Sophie demonstrated with that man who now clearly occupied the paternal space he himself had voluntarily abandoned. "I understand," Robert murmured, backing toward the door with surprising dignity that contrasted with his self-interested appearance. "I hope you are very happy in the life you built without me." His last words escaped as an involuntary confession before disappearing. "You deserved better than me. You always deserved better." Night had fallen when, hours later, Sophie proudly showed Michael her investigative article on corruption in the judicial system, her eyes shining with the same passion for truth he had seen in the journalist during the dark days of the struggle for Helen's life. The state women's prison rose as an imposing monument to the fallen powerful, its grey walls witnessing the relentless democracy of justice that, though belated, had finally reached the aristocratic salons that for so long had seemed immune to its claws. Helen walked the corridors escorted by guards, whose gazes oscillated between admiration and curiosity, her steps echoing against the concrete floor like the beats of a heart that, against all odds, continued to pulse with renewed life after nearly being silenced forever in the electric chair that now awaited a new occupant. Her hands, which weeks earlier had trembled under the weight of unjust handcuffs, were now free, though they sweat cold before the encounter she herself had requested, a confrontation that Michael had considered unnecessary and even dangerous for her emotional recovery, but which Helen knew was essential to finally close the circle of pain that bound them in a cruel paradox of distorted motherhood. The visitors' room, with its floor-bolted tables and uncomfortable chairs strategically positioned, emanated the unmistakable aroma of cheap disinfectant and controlled despair, the institutional perfume of prisons that Helen instantly recognized as a trigger for memories she would rather forget. The female guard, whose eyes conveyed professional distrust mixed with incomprehension at the unusual request, opened the door separating visitors from inmates with a brusque motion that announced the arrival of that establishment's most talked-about prisoner. 15 minutes, the uniformed woman announced, her tone suggesting she considered that time excessive for such an encounter. "I'll be watching through the glass. Any suspicious move, and I'll end it immediately." Constance Whitmore entered the room, dragging chains on her ankles, her once majestic body now seeming to wither under the ill-fitting orange uniform that had replaced the designer dresses and impeccable suits that once composed her socialite wardrobe. Her face, devoid of the makeup that had long served as a mask to the world, now revealed every expression line, every mark that age and, more recently, the weight of prison had sculpted into her once perfectly cared-for skin. Her eyes, however, still carried the fierce glint of a wounded predator, mixing aristocratic pride and persistent disbelief at the reversal that had transformed her life of privilege into a nightmare of confinement and public humiliation. "Did you come to gloat over my misfortune?" Constance snapped without preamble when she finally sat down before Helen, her words as sharp as poisoned stilettos thrown to wound before being wounded, the defensive strategy of one who had spent her life attacking to remain invulnerable. Her fingers, stripped of the valuable rings that once adorned them, drummed nervously on the metal surface of the table, betraying the anxiety her rigid posture desperately tried to hide. "Did you come to see how the mighty fall? Or perhaps you want details on how I planned everything, to feed the report of your journalist friend?" Helen sustained that gaze laden with bitterness and defiance, without wavering, like someone who had already faced much worse storms and survived to tell the tale. Her eyes, which had stared death itself in the face and returned from it, now conveyed a disturbing serenity that momentarily disconcerted the fallen aristocrat. "No," she finally replied in a controlled voice that carried not hatred, but genuine existential curiosity. "I came because I need to understand. How can a mother do that to another mother? How can you look another woman in the eyes day after day, knowing that you were condemning her to death to save your son? Do you have any idea what my daughter suffered thinking she would lose me forever? The nights she cried herself to sleep from exhaustion. The terror I lived through imagining her alone in the world, vulnerable and helpless." The silence that followed had physical weight, filling the space between them like a living entity that breathed and pulsed with truths too painful to be articulated. Constance averted her gaze for the first time, her shoulders gradually losing the artificial stiffness with which she had entered, like a marble statue slowly turning into vulnerable flesh. "I would do anything for my son. Anything," she finally confessed, her voice breaking on the sharp edges of the confession like a wave against relentless rocks. Unexpected tears sprang from her eyes, defying decades of aristocratic self-control. "When that captain threatened Daniel, I could only think of protecting him. I didn't think of you. I didn't think of your daughter. I didn't think of anything but my son. A mother's love blinded me completely, turned me into a monster, capable of sacrificing innocence without hesitation." Helen watched that woman crumbling before her, no longer the powerful Constance Whitmore, who commanded society with an iron fist in a silk glove, but simply another mother whose distorted devotion to her son had led her down irreparable paths of destruction. "I would also do anything for my daughter," Helen admitted, recognizing the terrible paradox that connected them beyond the divisions of class and circumstance. "That's why I hurt my husband when he abused her, why I accepted the conviction the first time without fighting to protect her. I understand a mother's desperation in the face of a threat to her child, but I don't understand how you could condemn another mother to death, knowing exactly what that would mean for an innocent daughter." Constance raised her tear-stained face, her mask of arrogance completely dissolved for the first time in decades, revealing the vulnerable woman who had always existed behind the impenetrable facade she had built. "I have no excuses," she whispered as a confession wrung from the depths of a long-dormant soul. "Every night in this cell, I relive the moment I put the poison in that cup, the moment I planted the evidence against you. I see your daughter's face in court, devastated by the conviction, and I know I deserve to be here, perhaps even deserve the fate I planned for you." Helen rose slowly, her decision already crystallized in the heart that the journey through the valley of death had purified of petty hates and petty revenges. "I will speak to the prosecutor tomorrow," she announced with a serene firmness that made Constance look up in confused disbelief. "I don't want you to die in the electric chair. I don't want your son to lose his mother the same way my daughter almost lost me. Death does not bring true justice, only more pain. But you need to face the consequences of what you did, not as punishment, but as a possibility for redemption." As she walked away, leaving behind a stunned Constance who seemed not to fully comprehend the meaning of that unexpected mercy, Helen felt as if invisible chains that still bound her to the past were finally loosening, allowing her to breathe fully for the first time since that whole tragedy had begun. The noble courtroom gleamed under the golden light that penetrated through the century-old stained glass, casting colorful mosaics on the tense faces that awaited the outcome of what had become the most talked-about case of the decade. The sepulchral silence was occasionally broken by the creaking of the ancient carved wooden chairs where the divided audience was accommodated. On one side, those clamoring for vengeance proportional to the crime committed by the fallen aristocrat. On the other, the few who still held loyalty to the family that had ruled the city's destinies like a private empire for generations. Constance Whitmore, dressed in forced simplicity that contrasted violently with the opulence that had characterized her throughout her life, kept her gaze fixed on the podium, her handcuffed hands resting on the table like wounded birds unable to take flight, as Judge Samuel Wallace granted the floor to the witness no one expected, Helen Carter, the woman who had nearly been executed for a crime she did not commit. Helen crossed the central aisle like a shipwrecked survivor, returning to tell her story, each step carrying the weight of the death she had nearly experienced and the life she now valued as an unexpected heavenly gift. Her eyes, which had faced the abyss of injustice and returned with a wisdom few could understand, scanned the courtroom until they found Sophie, sitting between Michael and Aunt Margaret, her unwavering emotional support during that final ordeal. On the other side, Daniel Whitmore watched it all with an inscrutable expression, his features marked by a recent and painful sobriety, his bloodshot eyes now no longer from chemical substances, but from remorse that seemed to consume him from within like corrosive acid. "Mrs. Carter," the judge's voice reverberated through the courtroom like a solemn invitation for the unlikely to occur, "you requested to testify today not as a victim seeking maximum punishment, but to make an unusual request to the court. You have the floor." The silence that followed weighed like lead on those present, as Helen adjusted the microphone with hands that, surprisingly, did not tremble, nor showed hesitation in the face of the monumental responsibility she had voluntarily assumed. "Most esteemed ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Helen began, her voice acquiring strength and clarity that contrasted with the physical frailty her body still exhibited after the weeks of nightmare on death row. "I stand before this court today, not driven by hatred or thirst for revenge, but by the profound conviction that true justice cannot be built upon the same foundations that sustain the injustice that nearly destroyed me." Her eyes momentarily met Constance's, conveying not naive forgiveness, but a transcendental understanding that made the aristocrat avert her gaze, unable to bear the weight of that unexpected mercy. "Justice is not about revenge or disproportionate retribution. If I asked for this woman's death, I would be equal to her. Someone who does not care about the suffering of another family, someone who believes that a life can legitimately be sacrificed to satisfy personal needs. I ask this court to commute any death sentence to life imprisonment, allowing Constance Whitmore to have what she tried to deny me, the possibility of reflection, repentance, and perhaps redemption." A collective murmur ran through the room like a seismic wave, the magnitude of that gesture of clemency shaking even the most hardened hearts of disbelief in human beings. Daniel's eyes, fixed on Helen as if contemplating an incomprehensible supernatural vision, suddenly overflowed with silent tears that traced bright paths down his pale cheeks. In an unexpected move that surprised even his lawyer, the Whitmore heir rose abruptly, desperately gesturing for the word that the judge, after a momentary hesitation, granted with a solemn nod. "My mother committed this crime because of me." The confession burst from his lips like a dam breaking under unbearable pressure, each word carrying decades of accumulated and recently awakened guilt. "She always protected me from the consequences of my actions, from small childhood misdemeanors to serious crimes as an adult. Whenever I stumbled, she erected invisible walls of privilege and money to shield me from the reality that any other citizen would face." His gaze, now clear after weeks of forced detoxification, swept the courtroom until it found his mother, whose face contorted in silent plea for him to be silent. "But this time, I need to take my share of responsibility, not only for the murder of Captain Montgomery, but for having become the kind of man who needed such desperate and destructive protection." The sentence, when finally pronounced after hours of deliberation, fell like a divine hammer on the Whitmore dynasty. Life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole for Constance, total confiscation of assets and properties acquired with money stained by decades of corruption and covered-up crimes, and additional compensation for Helen and other victims identified during the expanded investigation. Franklin, the patriarch who had remained in absolute silence throughout the trial, rose mechanically upon hearing the sentence, heading for the door without looking even once at his convicted wife. The divorce petition had already been filed that morning, symbolizing the final abandonment that completed the spectacular downfall of the woman who had once reigned supreme over high society. Spring covered the city when Daniel Whitmore stopped in front of the Hands of Hope store. His reflection in the window revealed a transformed man, sober for 6 months, humble in simple clothes bought with his stockroom assistant's salary, hands calloused by work he had never imagined doing. He took a deep breath before pushing open the door, making the bell tinkle the announcement of his arrival. Sophie, attending an elderly lady at the counter, froze upon recognizing him, her eyes carrying maturity disproportionate to her 15 years, filled with instant distrust. Helen emerged from the workshop carrying craft pieces and stopped upon seeing the visitor, her expression revealing not fear but watchful caution. She deliberately placed the box on the counter with controlled movements. "Sophie, could you take over the workshop for a few minutes? I think Mr. Whitmore and I need to talk." When her daughter reluctantly obeyed, Helen approached, indicating a reserved seating area with armchairs. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," Daniel declared before she could speak. "I know that some things are unforgivable. Rehabilitation taught me that reparation is more important than forgiveness." His hands trembled with genuine emotion. "I have training in administration that I've never used for anything productive. Maybe I could help with the store's accounting without charging anything. It's the least I can do." Helen studied him like one examining a precious stone for flaws. "Why should I trust you? How would I know it's not some strategy to manipulate public opinion or spying to benefit your mother? Why seek redemption through me specifically?" "Because I'm equally guilty," he responded, without averting his gaze. "My self-destructive behavior and arrogance led my mother to those desperate acts. And I chose you because your ability to plead for her life, even after everything, demonstrated a humanity I had never experienced before. I need to learn that to break the destructive cycle of my family." Sophie, who had silently returned, interrupted. "Everyone deserves a second chance, don't they, Mom? That's what you always taught me. That's what you demonstrated by defending Mrs. Whitmore's life in court. If you don't truly believe in that possibility of redemption, then it was all just an empty gesture." The words struck Helen like a precise arrow. After a long silence, she finally nodded. "You can help for a few hours a week initially. We'll see how it goes before any more permanent commitment." 3 weeks later, Daniel visited Constance in prison. The former socialite, diminished in the orange uniform, awaited with barely concealed anxiety, her makeup-free eyes revealing an unprecedented vulnerability when her son sat before her. "I'm working at her store," he revealed, observing his mother's reaction. "The woman you tried to destroy is helping me rebuild my life. She's teaching me not only about administration, but mainly about dignity, about rebuilding oneself without bitterness. It's a lesson in humanity I never received in our mansion." Constance, initially shocked, gradually softened her expression. "I was always so afraid of losing you," she confessed almost inaudibly. "Ever since you were born, you became my only reason for existing, and when I saw that captain threatening to take you away from me, something primitive simply exploded." Silent tears slid down her face. "Perhaps it's fitting that she's now saving you. Maybe that's the true poetic justice." The next day at the municipal cemetery, Daniel laid white flowers on Captain Montgomery's grave, his eyes conveying solemn respect for the man who had simply tried to do his duty. He did not immediately notice Helen, Sophie, and Michael, discreetly observing the scene from a distance. "He's trying to make peace with his past," Michael commented, his arm protectively around Sophie's shoulders. "It's a painful process, but necessary for any genuine rebuilding. Just like all of us," Helen replied softly, holding her daughter's hand with that tenderness only mothers who've nearly lost everything can express. "Each carries different scars, but we all need to move forward without letting the past consume us. Wounds can become strength when we learn their lessons." Her gaze swept over the small group they formed, recognizing the unlikely family fate had forged through unimaginable pain, devastating loss, and finally, unexpected redemption. The bonds tying them now, forged in the fire of direst adversities, seemed more genuine than many built under conventional circumstances. The first raindrops began to fall, delicate as purifying tears, as the four walked together out of the cemetery. Sophie leaned on Michael's shoulder, who had become the pillar her biological father had never been able to be. Helen watched Daniel a few steps ahead, seeing in him no longer the privileged Whitmore son, but simply a man struggling to rebuild himself from the ashes of his mistakes. On the distant horizon, beyond the storm clouds now unleashing their burden on the city, golden rays of sun stubbornly insisted on piercing the darkness, a silent, luminous promise that even after the most devastating storms of human existence, light eventually finds its way back, illuminating new beginnings no one could have imagined. Did you like the story of Helen Carter and Sophie Carter? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.